An anonymous UC Berkeley professor has dropped a massive red pill on Black Lives Matter after releasing an anti-BLM letter. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Obvious, and today on Medium, featuring a hacker known as 4chan. Headline: Anonymous letter from UC Berkeley professor concerning BLM/recent events. So this is an entire copy of this letter, here in full. It begins like this. Dear Professor X, Y, and Z, I am one of your colleagues at the University of California Berkeley. I have met you both personally, but do not know you closely, and I am contacting you anonymously with apologies. I am worried that writing this email publicly might lead to me losing my job, and likely all future jobs in my field. So you can already tell that this professor is scared to talk out, because he's talking out against the current establishment. That is to say, a left-wing establishment that defends groups like Black Lives Matter and even far-left activists. But they wrote this letter and now it's big news. He continues by saying, in your recent departmental emails, you mentioned our pledge to diversity, but I am increasingly alarmed by the absence of diversity of opinion on the topic of the recent protests and our community response to them. Now we're going to take a look at this entire letter, break it down, and find out what's going on, as this brave professor has clearly taken a stand against the woke ideology of his campus. So, let's read. In the extended links and resources you provided, I could not find a single instance of substantial counter-arguments or alternative narrative to explain the underrepresentation of black individuals in academia or their overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. The explanation provided in your documentation, to the near exclusion of all others, is univariate. The problems of the black community are caused by whites, or, when whites are not physically present, by infiltration of supremacy of the white variety and white systemic racism into Americans' brains, souls, and institutions. So, Berkeley, like a lot of other universities, are basically breeding grounds for far leftist ideology. Professors that are conservatives are being fired, and they're basically making the statement that they're saying, oh, we're going to support diversity and this is all white people's fault. The school is blaming white people for everything. Many cognate objections to this thesis have been raised by sober voices, including from within the black community itself, such as Thomas Sowell and Wilfred Riley. Those people are not racists or Uncle Toms. They are intelligent scholars who reject a narrative that strips black people of agency and systematically externalizes the problems of the black community onto outsiders. The view is entirely absent from the department and UCB-wide communiques. A counter-narrative exists. If you have time, please consider examining some of the documents I have attached at the end of this email. Now, I'm not sure if these documents are included, and I don't know if the following words are part of the documents or part of the letter, but we're going to continue here. Overwhelmingly, the reasoning provided by BLM and allies is either primarily anecdotal, as in the case with the bulk of Ta-Nehisi Coates' undeniably moving article, or it is transparently motivated. As an example of the latter problem, consider the proportion of black incarcerated Americans. The proportion is often used to characterize the criminal justice system as anti-black. However, if we use the precise same methodology, we would have to include that the criminal justice system is even more anti-male than it is anti-black. Would we characterize criminal justice as systematically misandrous conspiracy against innocent American men? Now, this is a very good point. They're basically pointing out statistics that show it's mostly men who end up in prison. And women, actually, they get lighter sentences. They receive less serious punishments, even for committing the same crimes. The author continues, I hope you see that this type of reasoning is flawed and requires a significant suspension of our rational faculties. Hey yo! Black people are not incarcerated at higher rates than their involvement in violent crime would predict. This fact has been demonstrated multiple times across multiple jurisdictions in multiple countries, and yet, I see my department uncritically reproducing a narrative that diminishes black agency in favor of a white-centric explanation that appeals to the department's apparent desire to shoulder the white man's burden and to promote a narrative of white guilt. The author continues, if we claim that the criminal justice system upholds supremacy of the white variety, why is it that Asian Americans, Indian Americans, and Nigerian Americans are incarcerated at vastly lower rates than white Americans? This is a funny sort of supremacy. Even Jewish Americans are incarcerated less than Gentile whites. I think it's fair to say that your average person who holds supremacist views disapproves of Jews, and yet these alleged supremacists incarcerate Gentiles at a vastly higher rate than Jews. None of this is addressed in your literature. None of this is explained beyond hand-waving and ad hominems. Those are racist dog whistles. The model minority myth is supremacist. Only fascists talk about black-on-black crime. Ad nauseum. These types of statements do not amount to counter-arguments.
Not an argument!
Now, what he goes on to say next is pretty interesting, and, this really highlights how modern academics basically has no freedom of speech, and if you're not a left-winger, if you're not on their side, you will get canceled. You will lose your job. They go on to say, I personally don't dare speak out against the BLM narrative, and with this barrage of alleged unity being mass-produced by the administration, tenured professorate, the UC administration, corporate America, and the media, the punishment for dissent is a clear danger at any time of widespread economic vulnerability. I am certain that if my name were attached to this email, I would lose my job and all future jobs, even though I believe in and can justify every word I type. And this is where they drop one of the biggest red pill nukes. Here you can see. The vast majority of violence visited on the black community is committed by black people. There are virtually no marches for these invisible victims, no public silences, no heartfelt letters from the UC regents, deans, and department heads. The message is clear. Black lives matter only when whites take them. Black violence is expected and insoluble, while white violence requires explanation and demands a solution. Please look into your hearts and see how monstrously bigoted this formulation truly is. Bravo! Bravo, Professor. I'm glad somebody finally said it. A lot of the problems in the black community are present within the black community. It is something that has not been addressed for many, many years. You're not even allowed to talk about it these days. No discussion is permitted for non-black victims of black violence, who proportionally outnumber black victims of non-black violence. Now, they bring up a really, really big point. This is another red pill nuke. It's very simple. If you look at FBI statistics, it is very clear that when it comes to racial violence, the vast majority of victims are white. This is a simple fact. This is what the FBI has said, and that's where we are, and that's what this author brings up. Now, I'm going to skip down a little bit here and focus on the parts that I think are important. This paragraph in particular. As a final point, our university and department has made multiple statements celebrating and eulogizing George Floyd. Floyd was a multiple felon who once held a pregnant black woman at gunpoint. He broke into her home with a gang of men and pointed a gun at her pregnant stomach. He terrorized the women in his community. He sired and abandoned multiple children, playing no part in their support or upbringing, failing one of the most basic tests of decency for a human being. He was a drug addict and sometime drug dealer, a swindler who preyed upon his honest and hardworking neighbors. And yet the regents of UC and historians of UCB History Department are celebrating this violent criminal, elevating his name to virtual sainthood, a man who hurt women, a man who hurt black women. With full collaboration of the UCB History Department, corporate America, most mainstream media outlets, and some of the wealthiest and most privileged opinion-shaping elites of the USA, he has become a culture hero, buried in a golden casket. His family showered with gifts and praise. Americans are being socially pressured into kneeling for a violent, abusive misogynist. A generation of black men are being coerced into identifying with George Floyd, the absolute worst specimen of, wow, these are some strong words. He basically says Floyd is a terrible example for good humanity, because he was a very bad person. I'm just paraphrasing here. I'm ashamed of my department. I would say that I'm ashamed of both of you, but perhaps you agree with me and are simply afraid, as I am, of the backlash of speaking the truth. Truth to power, my brother. Truth to power. Speak it. Shout it to the skies. He says, it's hard to know what kneeling means. when you have to kneel to keep your job. Yep, these leftists. They claim to be on the right side of history, yet they ask you to bend the knee to worship their woke ideology. Now, I don't know about you, but isn't it usually the villains in most stories that make you bow to them and bend the knee? Now, here's the best part about this whole story. The professor who wrote this was black. He goes on to say, "It shouldn't affect the strength of my argument above. But for the record, I write as a person of color. My family have been personally victimized by men like Floyd. We are aware of the condescending depredations of the Democrat Party against our race. The humiliating assumption that we are too stupid to do STEM, that we need special help and lower requirements to get ahead in life, is richly familiar to us. I sometimes wonder if it wouldn't be easier to deal with open fascists, who at least would be straightforward in calling me names." So this has been a powerful letter. Let's read his conclusion here. "The ever-present soft bigotry of low expectations and the permanent claim that the solutions of the plight of my people rest exclusively on the goodwill of whites rather than our own hard work is psychologically devastating. No other group in America is systematically demoralized in this way. Well, white people are. By its alleged allies. And I just want to point that out. While black people in America are demoralized, I would say that white people are also vastly demoralized as well. We have an entire generation of young white children who are taught to hate themselves and that they are everything wrong with the world, and it is the saddest and most unjust thing ever. The author goes on to say, a whole generation of black children are being taught that only by begging and weeping and screaming will they get handouts from guilt-ridden whites. No message will surely devastate their futures, especially if whites run out of guilt. Or indeed, if America runs out of whites. Ooh, my gosh. Spicy meatball. He says, I hope you appreciate the frustration behind this message. I do not support BLM. I do not support the Democrat grievance agenda and the party's uncontested capture of our department. I do not support the party's co-opting my race, as Biden recently did in his disturbing interview, claiming that voting Democrat and being black are isomorphic.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
I condemn the manner of George Floyd's death and join you in calling for greater police accountability and police reform. However, I will not pretend that George Floyd was anything other than a violent misogynist, a brutal man who met a predictably brutal end. I also want to protect the practice of history. Cleo is no groveling handmaiden. To politicians and corporations like us, she is free. Now, this is a very powerful letter that tells a very inconvenient truth, especially for the Democratic Party and the modern left. Now, we've gone through most of this letter, and I really think that it is a powerful message. But I originally found this letter on 4chan, and they have a little bit more information about the origins of this letter and how people in UC Berkeley have responded. Here, Anonymous says, a Berkeley history professor posted an anti-BLM extremely based letter to a bunch of journalists and in their department. It's anonymous, and UCB has already put out 2 internal statements about it, calling on everyone to report it, ignore it, and involving the police. It's real and has been internally recognized as a threat. They say the letter is a magnificent white pill. It's proven to work on normies, family members, boomers, fence-sitters, girlfriends, and others. And then they have a mobile-friendly version of the letter, as well as advising them to send the letter to more people. One Anon says, if I'm right about the author's identity, and I'm about 80% sure I'm right, it's a black man. I'm surprised that he kept it anonymous because he's pretty outspoken, but after seeing the backlash, I get it. Now, some of the people at this school were completely horrified by this letter. Here you can see a Twitter user named Mahil Hamaroon who says, I'm a grad student in the Berkeley History Department. This email was sent to a number of us randomly from various different emails. Based on the contents and how it was circulated, it doesn't seem to have come from within our community. But it's horrific! And we're working on it. Imagine it being scared of words on a paper. I just find it so darn hilarious. And with this tweet, you see just how deranged and delusional these people really are. They're completely lost in the woke, insane bubble of regressive leftism. It's a complete intellectual black hole where no intelligent life survives. But you know what, my friends? That's pretty much the story. A black Berkeley professor drops a massive red pill on Black Lives Matter. I made this video so that more people who don't have the patience to read this letter have a chance to listen. But that's merely the obvious. Well, that's all for now, folks. What do you think about this letter and this black professor? Do you agree with the points here? Let me know what you think down below in the comment section. Now, as always, if you would like to support the work I do, you can join me on Patreon or Subscribestar. If you want to donate, there's DonorBox and Bitcoin. Links are down below. But one of the best things you can do is simply to share this video. The reason I make videos is to spread red pills. And what that means is, I just want people to know the truth. This is the job that journalists and the media used to do. But ever since they abandoned that job and that calling, it's up to independent media like me to do their jobs for them. So if you like the video, consider giving it a share. I also want to mention the Deus Vult line. Have you ever wanted to go on a crusade? Well, now you can, with a Deus Vult Knight Classic t-shirt. A majestic knight stands on the battlefield. We also have the Deus Vult Sword t-shirt design. You can find the link to the merch store down below in the description. Anyhow, thanks for watching. This has been Mr. Obvious, and I'll see you all next time.